Hey guys, what's up? I'm Noah, this is Analog Resurgence, and today I'm going to take a look at the difference between cinema film and photography film. Motion picture film and photography film are both, well, film, but what makes them different? So the widely used motion picture film formats out there right now are Super 8, 16mm, 35mm, and 70mm film. Now the main formats for photography film right now are 35mm and 120 medium format film. So then what's the difference between, say, Kodak's Vision 3 color negative motion picture film stock and Kodak's Portra color negative still film? Well, a couple of things actually, but they're important. Let's start with the chemical process behind these films. So motion picture color negative film stock, whether it's Super 8, 35, or even 70mm film, is all manufactured with one specific chemical process in mind. This chemical process is called ECN2. ECN stands for Eastman Color Negative. Now this process is only widely done by motion picture film labs. Now these film labs have very specialized machines, and they have the ability to run massive amounts of film through these chemical baths. And these machines are very different from the kinds of processors that you would find in your local 1-hour photo lab. Meanwhile, the current chemical process for color negative photographic films is called the C41 process. Now I've mentioned this in some previous videos, but again, C41 is the current chemical development process used for all modern color negative photographic films. So C41 developing and ECN2 developing are both used for color negative films, and they are very similar development processes. Now if you developed your photographic still films in this ECN2 motion picture chemical process, your images would actually be okay, because there's not an incredibly drastic difference between the two chemical processes. You might get a bit of a color shift here and there when putting photographic film through this motion picture process, but still, ECN2 is okay for C41 film. So if we use that logic and reverse it, can you take large rolls of, say, 35mm motion picture film and cut it down and load them into these plastic reloadable canisters, and then take stills with them and have your local photo labs develop these ECN2 films in their C41 machine? Nope. Now C41 as a chemical process would be fine to develop your Super 8, your 16, and your 35mm motion picture film in, and it would still develop your images properly and give you normal looking results. But there is one major difference from being able to drop off your rolled down still rolls of motion picture film at your local photo lab. All motion picture film has a very special layer on it that photographic film does not, the remjet layer. This special layer is only found on color negative motion picture films. It's an anti-halitation layer which actually prevents the film from unwanted reflections or scratching as it's moving through a cinema camera at really high speeds, which you shoot at when you're filming. Remjet actually stands for removed by jet, and this layer is washed away entirely during development at the motion picture lab using high-powered jets of water in their developing machines. Now if we look at some still film here on the right and some cinema film here on the left, you can see that the back of the cinema film has a darker look to it. This can actually be scratched away, resulting in some black gunk. So a big difference between cinema film labs and photo film labs is that these smaller photo lab developing machines do not have the ability to wash away this remjet layer when they're developing the film. So if you have small rolls of 35mm motion picture film or any sort of motion picture film that you've rolled down or bought somewhere and have shot stills with, do not drop it off at a local photography film lab, because running this type of film through their machine, if they don't realize that it's motion picture film, can actually have really bad effects on their equipment. It can really damage and contaminate the entire chemical mixtures in their machines and really mess up the filters of these machines as well. This remjet layer on your motion picture film will actually turn into this black liquid when it's going through these machines, and these smaller machines in these photographic labs don't have the ability to properly dispose of and handle this remjet layer. So that's an instance where you definitely will not make your way into the good books of your local photo lab if you're giving them film that has that extra layer on it. And also your pictures will come out completely messed up. and could potentially damage other people's rolls in the process. Now, if you've managed to shoot one of these rolled down smaller rolls of motion picture film, then your options are to either take it to a cinema lab and hope that they'll process it for you, which can be a little bit rare because it's somewhat of an inconvenience at times to be able to process really small rolls on these really large machines at motion picture labs. Or you can even get some chemical kits yourself and do the film at home. So if you just get a basic C41 kit, which you can get from a few different places online, and I'll throw some links down in the description for some resources on that, you can use these chemicals to develop motion picture film at home. But be aware that this remjet layer on these motion picture films will drastically cut in half the lifespan of your chemicals from these kits. And you still have to remove this remjet layer on your film, and you can do that sometimes with a special rinse before you start developing, or you can even do it afterwards with your film hanging and you just run a sponge along it. But this can get really messy. When in doubt about whether or not you come into a roll of cinema film by mistake without realizing it, then you can always look at the sprockets on your film. These are normal still film sprockets, and these are motion picture sprockets. Subtly different, but enough to help you identify. Now, there is actually a company called Cinestill that makes 35mm and 120 medium format film. Now, they actually take Kodak motion picture color negative film and roll it down into small rolls and sell so that you can take stills on those film stocks. But the big difference is that during their process, they actually run it through machines to remove this remjet layer so that they're safe to be processed at local photo labs in C41 machines. So that's the main difference between motion picture film and photographic film. And the remjet layer is only something that you need to be aware of if you're shooting motion picture color negative film. This remjet layer doesn't actually exist on the motion picture black and white film, so those chemical processes are interchangeable. Also, slide film, or reversal film as we usually call it when talking about it in its motion picture form, still uses the E6 process for both motion picture and photographic films, so those two are interchangeable as well. So just be really careful if you're shooting color negative motion picture film stock that you've rolled down, because you really don't want to take that stuff to a photo lab without realizing what it could do to their machinery. It's also not something that all labs will immediately recognize, and it's just something that could be run through a machine entirely by mistake. So just be aware of what you're shooting, and especially if you're shooting rolls that you've rolled down yourself or you've gotten from somewhere else and they're coming to the lab with unlabeled canisters. You want to be able to give the lab as much detail as you know about the film so that they can do all the processing the right way. Thank you guys so much for checking this out, and I hope that you've enjoyed and learned a little thing or two about motion picture film and photo film, and just a little bit more about how the technical process works when it comes to the difference between the two. And subscribe if you haven't done so already, as I continue to talk all sorts about all this analog content every week, from motion picture film to photographic film to chemical processes and everything in between. Thanks so much, and I'll see you guys soon.